trouble picking a favorite fish, but I never trust a fish that has both eyes on the same side of its head. So I've just got this thing about halibut. They worry me, but I love them. Once you get them in the kitchen, they're well behaved. Up until that point, they have some issues. So I would like to talk about the ways that Captain Tiffany and I have fished for halibut on the charter boat. And we've, I made a comment earlier on the phone that I had caught thousands of halibut. And I was laughing at myself down here when I did the number of years, the number of trips, the number of people, the number of halibut. There's a lot more than that. But there's still some out there, so you can go catch some. We left some on purpose. And these rods that she brought to show you, and you're welcome to come up even while we're talking or whatever, take a look at some of them. Some of these are the exact blanks and whatnot that we hook people up with halibut. And there's only one rod here that you can't buy.
That's right.
Let her sell.
Well, Bill won't let me.
And that is this two-piece here, because Tiffany went to the World Rod Building Competition and built 2 rods for it. This one was in the professionally judged category, and it was selected among the group of the top 10 rods in the world. And so, I want you to come up and take a look at what she did. This is a dream catcher, and it's a weave. There's this big honking round loom here and one below it with hundreds of threads, and she's literally weaving. And that's how that's made. So, come on and look at those. You can't buy that one, but you can look at it. She can make you one just like it, but the rest of them, you can talk to her about buying. How many of you will be fishing from a kayak? We won't go there. That would add a pretty long segment anyway, so just as well. Boats, how many of you have bounce balled for halibut? Successfully.
Not successful.
I have.
Okay. I was really fortunate in being taught to bounce ball by 2 of the pioneers on a boat named the Pioneer of that. It grew out of commercial salmon fishing, because those salmoniers, they kept noticing that, they've got these downrigger things that are unbelievable, right? They got this thing that looks like a box, and they got a big cable down from that and a bunch of stops. And on their lowest stops, they kept coming up with halibut. Hard to feel sorry for somebody with a halibut on the line, but back at the dock, they had a buyer waiting for salmon, not halibut, okay? So, but they got to talking amongst themselves, and they said, obviously there's something to trolling for halibut. So after salmon season, let's get together, put our brains together, go out and try some stuff, and they developed this technique. And it has become the most effective form of halibut fishing we've ever experienced. And you do it with a certain rig. There's a fair number of people that are trying to make a go of it with downriggers, and it's possible, but downriggers, you don't dare fish intimately enough with the bottom with a downrigger, because you don't want that whole thing yanking real hard when you got a rock or kelp or whatever in the way. So generally, it's a form of slow trolling. Somebody always wants to know, well, what speed do I troll? That's the trouble part. That's where we burn some brain cells. We'll talk a little bit about that, but I just want to warn you, that part ain't easy. See that good old familiar 3-way swivel? Well, that's how the technique started for these bounce ballers, at old salmon fishermen. And what they would do is, of course, they would tie one end from their rod, one end down to a weight, and then the other end back to the business end, which salmoneers, of course, they're usually using flashers and then a lure behind the flasher. And we've kind of changed that for halibut, though flashers will still work. But that three-way swivel was how it's done for a long time. If you're using a three-way swivel when you try bounce balling, stop it. Because a real cheap, under $1, last time I looked, thing that came out that just blew it out of the water is that little thing, a slider. Just a super simple little piece of thing. It's a tube. Your line goes right through there. And it's a snap. A weight hangs on there, or a line down to a weight. This makes all the difference in the world. We are much better. We are losing far fewer halibut and other fish by using this than we did with this. And the reason is because when a halibut or some other fish bites the bait, and when it gets around to doing a big head toss, with the three-way swivel, it's yanking that around and the weight is tied to it, so it's yanking the weight around. And as we so woefully know, halibut have these soft spots in their mouths where the hook can pull out way too easy. And that happened a lot. With the slider, however, fish does a head toss, it just pulls line through there. The fish isn't yanking on the weight, so there isn't near as much pull on that hook. And we're losing far fewer fish. Like, the difference is noticeable, it's impressive. So, these guys, find them at your local tackle store, just buy a handful of them. They're pretty cheap. I bet you they are still under $1. When we first started carrying them, they were like 50 cents.
Right. For halibut, right.
And I just wish there would be more really game-changing things that would come out for less than $1. We don't get many of those, but here's one. So go get yourself some sliders.
I get them at Big Five, Dave.
There you go.
Yeah.
Or just
Cheap
about any
there.
place that carries tackle. Now, the rig we're gonna use is gonna be like this. First, you take that slider, put your line through the slider, tie it on to here. Hang a weight from that slider. I generally go with about 18 inches of line, but the amount of line from the slider down to the weight depends on the bottom. If you're in an area where there's a little bit of rubble on the bottom, or weeds or small rocks or whatever, make it a little bit longer, keep your lure up above that. Your line to your rod for bounce balling should be braided line. It needs to be braided line, because braided line will cut through the water so much better, and it will help you keep that nice 45-degree angle. 65-pound braided line, which is what we use a lot for halibut. If we use like 60-pound mono, instead of that angle, we'd be having that angle and we'd be having trouble holding the bottom. It's that much of a difference. That braid just cuts through the water real nice on a slow troll. This line here, from there to your device here, get to that in a minute, doesn't matter what it is. I generally use heavy mono. Its whole job is to keep from losing everything behind it, which is the expensive part. So just, 60 pound, whatever, just heavy mono. The distance is important. That's roughly 40 inches, give or take a few. And that distance is important because it's what gives this blade its room to develop its action. The blade's job is to reflect light everywhere and look like a school of baitfish. That's what it does. And then there's a straggler behind it. Never a good idea to be straggler out in nature. You get it that way. The blade, now this is a Dodger. Generally made of metal, not always, generally, and usually with prism tape. And it has slight opposing bends at the end, just kind of slight. And that's what gives it that action as you slow troll through the water. Just kicking, reflecting light everywhere, looking like a school of bait fish. The other device, which the salmoniers use more, is a flasher. The flasher, generally made out of plastic, not always, usually also with prism tape. It has much more pronounced bends at the end, much more pronounced. And it too does the same type of thing. But the difference in action between the two is that when you bump up your speed just a little bit, the Dodger just gets a little bit more erratic action. But if you're using a flasher, it gets a full rotation going. Now, in generalities, which don't always work in fishing, but in generalities, the salmon seem to like that full rotation, whereas the halibut generally prefer that erratic back and forth. So, having told you that, you're gonna go out and catch one of these things using a flasher and go, see, and I'll go, good for you, good for you. But in general, you're gonna have better luck with a Dodger than with a flasher. This short, emphasize that point, leader back here needs to be fluorocarbon. This is the part you're fooling the fish with. And fluorocarbon, if you take this and the same size monofilament and hold it up here in this light next to each other, look almost identical. But it's a different material, and the fluorocarbon doesn't reflect or refract light the same way that mono does, so underwater it kind of disappears. So it's become our stealth leader of choice, and that's why. In this case, it really matters. Did I mention short? Thought I did. The reason that leader is short is because this lure develops no real action on its own. I've got a little single rub tail in here that'll get a little flutter to it, but the lure itself develops no action. So I run a short leader so that it picks up just a little bit of the kick from this blade. Just helps it make it look a little bit more alive. And that can make all the difference in the world when attracting a strike from a halibut. If, however, you're using a lure that does, like maybe a spoon or something like that, or what's the absolute best lure for halibut in the surf?
Lucky Craft.
110 flash minnow. There are others, but the Lucky Craft 110 flash minnow owns the surf when it comes to halibut. Well, if they like it in the surf, they don't mind it offshore either. You can run one of those on here. But in that case, here's a lure that does develop some of its own action, so run a little longer leader, maybe like 24 inches, something like that. It's still gonna look like the straggler to the school of bait fish, and it's the easy one to pick off. But if it develops its own action, give it a little bit longer leader. So that's basically the way this rig looks. Here is for the boat, and this cute little guy here is for the kayaks. But we're not worried about kayaks today. That hoochie is a orange splatter with a single tail grub inside. Good choice, good choice. What's the number one choice of all for hoochies? Purple haze. I'm sure Jimi Hendrix had something to do with this. But this guy, really, if I was sent anywhere in the world to fish and was only allowed to take one thing, I would take a purple haze hoochie. I can fool more fish, more places, more species with that than with anything. I mean, it just has good action to it. And that purplish haze, that almost like an oil, iridescent sheen on it. What I think, my theory, is that to a fish, it looks like that nice fish slime. Nice, fresh, here's a healthy thing to eat, I'm gonna eat it. Okay? Anybody wanna know how fast to troll?
Yes.
Oh, you know better than that. Okay, we'll do that.
1 to 2 knots. If you can go that slow. Yeah.
Okay,
Or she's-
I'm hearing these numbers going here. First off, how do you know how fast we're trolling? Well, come on, we all look at the GPS and it tells us, okay? That is a bit of information that will do you no good. In fact, it might even cause you trouble. I don't want you looking at your GPS. You know those little yellow Post-it notepads? Take one of those out there with you, and when you start bounce balling for halibut, take one of those off and put it on your GPS right on that place where it tells you how fast you're trolling. Don't want you looking at it. Here's why. Let me give you an example. Let's say we're trolling today this way at about 2 knots. You know that because you cheated, you lifted up the Post-it and you looked at it. Stop doing that, okay? Said you're going 2 knots. Well, today there happens to be a current running this way at about 2 knots. Not an uncommon situation at all. So, what is your speed through water?
4.
This is not the math class, is it? Next room. No.
0.
Thank
Which
you.
direction?
That would be a 0, okay? So, we're trolling at 0 speed. That whole big fancy rig is just hanging down there doing nothing. Well, it is doing one thing. It's creating what we call macrame. And pretty soon you're gonna have to reel it up and do what we call reverse macrame before you can continue fishing. So, this is just a bad situation. So never mind what that GPS tells you. That's not the information. It tells you speed over ground. We could get all into the satellites and all that, but it tells you speed over ground. It's speed through water that matters. Now, we used to have these cool transducers with the little paddle wheels.
Yeah.
That told you your speed through water, at least on the surface, which may be different than on the bottom. But it gave you an indication. But somehow our industry got too cool for paddle wheels on our transducers, so we can't seem to get those anymore. I miss them. So how do you know if you're trolling the right speed? You got one thing, or maybe more than one thing, on the boat that tells you if you're at the right trolling speed for this rig.
The angle of the.
Your rod tip.
It's your rod tip. Now you know it's at the bottom because if you're not fishing right near the bottom, I've already come around and broke your finger or did something to reprimand you, okay? It's called bounce balling. It's a form of slow trolling, but it is not called slow trolling. It's called bounce balling for a reason. You need to hold that rod. See, those guys that taught me how to do this, those commercial guys, when we went out on their boat the first time, the 3 of us, 2 of them took me out on one of their boats. Usually it's 1 person, 1 boat. But on the way out of harbor, they're duct taping their right hand. And I'm looking at them, and we're talking, you know, and then the conversation continues. He tears it off, hands it to his buddy, he duct tapes his hands. Conversation continues. He hands it to me, and I said, wait, why are we duct taping our hand? And they said, oh, well, you're gonna be holding this rod with about a 3-pound weight at the end for about 10, 11 hours today. How strong is your hand? Mind if I use some of that duct tape? Now, don't use duct tape. I only tell that story to explain that this can be pretty hard on the hands. But here's the thing. They would drive the boat with one hand and they would hold that rod with the other, and 2 to 3 times a minute. So every 20 to 30 seconds, they would lower the rod tip to the water, feel the weight thump the bottom, and lift it back up. That's how close to the bottom they were trolling. And if they couldn't feel it thump the bottom, then they had to either reel up and put on a heavier weight, well, then they need more duct tape, or slow the boat down. Now the commercial guys, they use clutches, so they could really get the right speed. But a lot of people will throw a couple buckets over the side or something like that. Point is, bounce balling. These same people would run 2 or 3 or more rods sitting in rod holders near the bottom. And they would catch fish, but they explained it like that. They called this one their money stick. They said the money stick makes the mortgage payment, puts the kids through college. The rest of them are just for extras. The money stick caught more fish than the rest of the rods on the boat put together. That's the importance of bouncing that. So that rod tip, I have thousands of hours of my eyes glued to rod tips. That'll do something to you, but you catch more fish, so it's okay. But that rod tip, you want to see it just doing this little twitch. Every time that blade kicks, the rod tip just twitches slightly. And that's what you're looking for. Now, here's the thing. Thank you. What we're all waiting for is for that rod to bend deep, the reel to zip, sky to be blue, birds to be singing, man, there's a big fish on there. We love that moment. But you don't always get that in halibut fishing. This is why I don't trust a fish with 2 eyes on the same side of its head. These things, you'll be trolling this lure, these things will come up off the bottom, they're looking at it with 2 eyes, same side of their head. Looking at it as they come up, and they will mouth it and they will just glide with you. It happens a lot. So many times on the boat, I'd be looking at all these rods, and one of them would just stop twitching. That's all. That's it. And I'd say, corner rod, set the hook. Now I don't want them to set the hook like it's on a big tuna. They got soft spots in their mouths. That just means lift it up about like that. And the person who in charge of that rod would look up at it and go, Captain, it's not doing anything. I know, set the hook. They'd look at their buddies and they'd all kind of go, Pretty soon he'd get up and he'd lift that rod and he'd go like this, and there would be nothing on it. Because that doesn't feel exactly natural. Now halibut's only gonna do that for so long before it just does this and swims away. And so they would do that to make me feel better. Nothing beyond there. I'd say, it's okay, we'll go find you another one. But there are lots of halibut lost or never realized, more than you could imagine in exactly that situation. So don't wait for that rod to bend double and the reel to scream. And the number is roughly 2. But that's speed through water, not speed over ground. Stop looking at the dang GPS when you're bounce balling. Now, when that magic moment occurs, and you get a halibut on there, and you're fighting it, this would happen so much on the boat. Person would be just all excited, just, reeling that thing, all happy, and they're looking at the water, and pretty soon it comes to the surface. They can see that fish. They can almost taste it at that point. And I tell them, okay, now when that fish gets close, okay, when that leader gets near the rod tip, I want you to step back and raise your rod tip. And they go, okay. And they're just turning that handle. I'd see him reach for the drag, and I'd break the finger, just discourage him, okay? You don't want to be tightening that drag. Let the fish take some line, it's okay. And they'd just be mesmerized because they see that fish. And they go, and the leader comes up, and I'd say, okay, Now raise the rod and step back, and they'd say, okay, and stand there and keep turning. And I'd, and the leader gets to the end and it can't go any further, and they're still turning the handle. And I go, it's okay, once you get the fish through the first guide, the rest are bigger, it'll be okay. The way we would deal with that on our charter boat is Captain Tiffany would come up behind them and she'd be watching, and when that leader got up there, she'd just glomp onto their shoulders and haul them backwards. Cause you're standing at the edge of the boat. Well, that's about an 8-foot rod right there. Maybe yours is a mere 7 feet. Maybe it's 9 feet, okay? And then you've got about 40 inches of leader past that. You've got a blade past that. You've got a leader past that. And you've got a fish past that. How many here have a gaff or a net with a 14-foot handle?
Nope.
See the problem? But this, when it's at the surface, is your greatest opportunity to lose that fish. This is your moment. If you wanted to lose a halibut, this is it. Just let that thing stay right there. See, because as soon as it gets to the surface and sees how cute you are, it will leave. So you've got to control that moment. When that fish gets to the surface, you have to keep it moving towards you until you can reach it with a gaff or a net. If there is any question about whether or not that fish is over 22 inches, if it might be 22 or under,
Net.
net. Preferably a soft net. If it's bigger than that, a gaff, but I want you to move everybody out of the way. I've seen a 25-pound halibut break a grown man's leg. They are just a tough, muscle-bound animal. Treat them with respect. When you get to the kitchen, it's all good. So that's kind of how we do that. And don't want to take up too much of your meeting, so I'm going to take questions. Appreciate your listening to me, and by all means, take a look at some of these rods. If you want one, talk to her about it. Sir.
Yeah, I have a question. Do you have any tips for an alternate technique if we happen to be on like a bigger boat where we're going to be anchored, where we might not be able to troll for halibut?
Yeah, remember that slider?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you take your slider and you just put your line through the slider and tie onto a swivel, link the line down to the weight, link the leader, and a small treble hook. Smaller than you would think you should use. Like if you got anchovies for bait, go with like a size 2 or even 4, depending on the size of the anchovies. And you go, that little thing? Yeah. And then with an anchovy, like put the hook on the top of the nose, not through it, the top. And that is just because that keeps that hook as away from trouble on the bottom, weeds, rocks, all that sort of stuff as possible, just having it on the top. Sardine, small mackerel, something like that, you can come up to a size 2 treble, maybe even a 1/0, but no bigger than that.
So the idea is that you have your weight is on the bottom.
Yes.
And then you've got your slider, like how, and then is there a way that the slider stops to keep it going from all?
When you put your line through the slider, you tie onto a barrel swivel and then link the leader to your hook. So the slider stops at the barrel swivel and the weight's hanging down from the bottom. A lot of people fishing from skiffs like inside the harbor here, or kayaks, or SUPs, or whatever they're fishing from that day, they may not use any leader down to the weight at all. They just put it on there. But the most important part in this kind of fishing is keep it out of gear. If you're fishing with a conventional, out of gear, your thumb on there. If you're fishing with a spinner, bail open, you're holding the line. Because the moment you feel that little twitch, and what kind of twitch? I'm talking about just that, and nothing more. Then you give it line. And you give it more line. And people on the boat always ask me, when do I set the hook? And there's only one answer: when the hook is in the fish's mouth. I got no better answer. You get better at that part over the years and decades, but that's really the answer. But yeah, the slider is your answer for that too.
Okay.
Can you tell us those line sizes again? The braid, the mono, and your fluorocarbon leader? Can you?
Yeah. The braid, it wouldn't matter how heavy it is, except that, you know, the heavier it is, the thicker it is, and you want that low angle when you're trolling to keep it near the bottom. So I generally go like 65. A lot of the commercial people will go 80. The line from the blade up to the slider really is, that can be just anything. Monofilament works just fine. And I like to use like around 60, just because I'm not fooling the fish with that part. I'm just trying to keep from losing the blade and the lure and the fish. Then it's the one between the blade and the lure, and you can also use baits. You know, halibut love mackerel. Boy, do they love mackerel. But that one needs to be fluorocarbon. And I typically, depending on where I'm fishing, if I'm fishing small boat inside a harbor or right along the coast, I might go like 15 pound, 10 pound. I've even used 8. But if I'm out a little deeper, I'd probably go with 25, 30 pound line. If I were to, I have bounce balled for halibut and caught them from inside the harbor, right behind the waves, on out to well over 100 feet, where I had to use 4 pound cannonball weights to hold the bottom. But if I was to average all of the depths of all of them, what would it be? If I was to average the depths of all the halibut we've bounce balled,
Average would be 60.
that's right, 60 feet. So if you've got no other visuals or sixth sense or anything, you know, for much of the year, that's a good place to try. During the warmest part, they'll come in a little shallower, you know. But 60 feet is good. But if I see bait balls, birds working, a lot of life in the water, whatever depth it is, that's where I'm gonna go, because they're awful good at finding their groceries, just like we are.